She was declared dead at dawn. Yet by midnight she knocked on Baker Street's door. "Welcome to Silent Case File. I'm your host, Pendleton. This community of mystery lovers is growing fast. Tell me where you're listening from tonight." Your comments light up every case we uncover. Don't be a silent witness. Now, let's open the file. It was on one of those peculiarly grey March mornings, when the London mist thickens not from rain, but from something more ancestral, as if the very stones of Baker Street exhaled secret, that I found Sherlock Holmes once more seated in his usual attitude, cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, hands steepled beneath his chin, and eyes closed to all appearances of the waking world. The fire crackled. Outside, carriages rolled by like ghosts over wet cobblestones. I had returned late the night before from a regimental reunion, and was nursing a mild headache and a more persistent sense of nostalgia. Holmes naturally had not stirred in my absence. "You are troubled, Watson?" he murmured, without opening his eyes. "Not at all, merely tired." "And perhaps disappointed that the old companions of your youth now resemble stockbrokers more than soldiers," I started. "Holmes, I never said—" "You didn't. But the mud on your boots carries the red grit of Temple Bar, and the cravat you chose today, silk, conservative, was one Miss Morstan gave you years ago, when you were, if memory serves, more hopeful. Your eyes, however, are fixed not on the fire, but on the case-box on the shelf. You are hoping for distraction." Before I could retort, a firm rapping came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later with a puzzled look, and a visiting card held as one might a dead insect. "She won't say her name, sir, but insists you'll want to see her." Holmes rose. "Show her in." The woman who entered was perhaps no more than 20, though her clothing, a governess's dark travelling coat, hem torn, damp with river mist, suggested a life whose burdens had fallen early. Her skin was pale as chalk, her hands gloved but trembling. Yet it was her eyes that unsettled me, those of one who had already glimpsed the face of death and had not entirely returned. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I didn't know where else to go. I believe someone tried to murder me last night." Holmes inclined his head. "You believe? What prevents certainty?" "I woke up in the water, floating near Blackfriars Bridge. I can't recall how I got there, only that I was at a house, a large house with music, and then nothing. I think I was pushed. I remember falling but not hitting the water." She paused, drawing a shuddering breath. "And I can't remember my name." Even Holmes, usually unmoved by dramatic claims, stiffened slightly. "Amnesia?" I asked gently. "Perhaps," she whispered. "Or fear? Or something worse?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Miss, are there any physical injuries?" She unfastened her coat to reveal a bruise, greenish-yellow with age, but faint fingerprints showed at her collarbone. A hand or hands had tried to force her down. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, examine her. Carefully." As I prepared my instruments, Holmes paced. "You say you remember music?" "A piano, a waltz, I think, but slowed down as if twisted, and a smell, lavender and smoke." He stopped. "Lavender and smoke. Curious." She looked up suddenly. "They said I was dead." "Who did?" Holmes asked sharply. "The constable who found me. When I woke on the riverbank, 2 men were standing over me. One said, 'She's not dead after all,' and the other replied, 'She wasn't meant to survive.' Then they ran." A silence fell, heavy as fog. Holmes looked at me. "Watson, cancel your appointments for the day. We have work." He turned back to the girl. "You may not remember your name, but someone does. And if they meant you to vanish, then your survival may be the most inconvenient fact in London today." He extended a hand, not in comfort, but with clinical purpose. Until we discover who you are, miss, you shall be known here as Violet Hope. You are safe under this roof, but not yet safe from the truth." Holmes stood a moment in thoughtful stillness, one hand resting lightly upon the back of his chair, the other gently curled under his chin. The girl, Violet Hope, as he had christened her, sat beside the hearth, eyes downcast but alert, her expression still caught somewhere between dread and disbelief. I finished my preliminary examination, noting a faint contusion behind her left ear, along with the older bruises around her shoulders and upper chest. There was no sign of broken bones, nor evidence of prolonged exposure to the elements, only that someone had hurt her and left her to drown. "She is fortunate," I said quietly, "though how she survived in those waters without hypothermia is a mystery in itself. She wasn't submerged long, I'd wager." Holmes nodded slowly, then moved to his desk. He took up a pen and sheet of notepaper. "Your coat," he said without turning. "Might I see the lining?" Violet hesitated, then stood and removed the soaked garment with trembling fingers. Holmes examined it minutely, holding the fabric close to the lamplight, even lifting a glass lens to study the inner seams. "Aha," he murmured, reaching delicately into a narrow rent beneath the hem. He extracted a minute object, no larger than a sixpence, encased in a fold of yellowed wax paper. He placed it on the desk for our inspection, a button. More specifically, a small carved ivory button of the sort one might find on a child's garment or a lady's bedgown. On its surface, almost imperceptibly, was a smear of something brownish red. "Blood?" I ventured. Holmes sniffed it. "Possibly, or rust. Either way, it was hidden deliberately. Miss Hope, do you recognize this?" She shook her head, biting her lip. "No, but it feels familiar." Holmes tapped his fingers against the desk, then sat upright with sudden animation. "There are three immediate facts which present themselves, Watson. First, that this woman was not merely attacked, but taken to a location of some refinement. There was music, the scent of lavender, a piano. Second, that she was discarded not far from Blackfriars, which means our villain likely calculated both tide and timing. And third, that despite this, she survived and remembers just enough to be dangerous." "To someone," I said, glancing at her. "To someone indeed. And now we must find out who." Holmes rose and strode to the fireplace. "I have a mind," he said, "to visit Blackfriars Bridge. There is nothing quite so eloquent as the scene of a failed crime." The fog had thickened by the time we arrived at the Thames embankment, creeping along the riverbank like a damp shroud. Violet had remained at Baker Street under Mrs. Hudson's watchful eye, given strict instructions to touch nothing and open the door to no one. Holmes moved with his usual brisk precision, stopping at intervals along the parapet of the bridge, occasionally crouching to examine a particular stone or railing. I followed, still half certain we were chasing spectres. Finally, he paused. "Here," he said. "See how the stone is scuffed? And there, scrapings on the iron rail, as though someone had been dragged or forced over the edge." I looked down at the river below, now sluggish and dark under the gaslights. "But if she was pushed here—" "She wasn't," Holmes interrupted. "She was dropped, very likely, from a barge or launch moored below. The bridge is far too public, even at night. No, this was staged for convenience. She was left to die where someone believed the water would carry her out with the tide, but they miscalculated. Either the tide turned early or they hesitated too long." As he spoke, his gaze flicked toward the opposite bank. "I'd wager a vessel moored near the South Pier would yield signs of recent use, but we've not the liberty to conduct such searches unauthorized." At that moment, A sharp whistle drew our attention. A constable was making his rounds, swinging his lantern low. "Good evening, sir," Holmes said, producing a card. "Sherlock Holmes. I'm making inquiries into an incident reported here early this morning. A young woman pulled from the river near this bridge." The constable, a wiry man with tired eyes, nodded. "I heard. Odd business. 2 men flagged down another officer, then vanished before we could take names." "Did they describe the woman?" I asked. "Said she were pale, like death, but breathing. Took her to St. Thomas's, but she bolted before the doctors could keep her. Someone said she looked frightened out of her skin." "Did these men say anything peculiar?" Holmes asked, casual in tone but sharp in focus. The constable frowned. "Well, the younger one said something odd. She wasn't meant to survive. Gave me a chill, that did. But then they were gone." Holmes thanked him, and we walked in silence until we had left the embankment behind. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you recall the Bankside masquerade? Last year, hosted by Lady Weatherby? The very one. A peculiar affair, strictly invitation only. Music, champagne, scandal, and lavender, if you'll remember. Her signature perfume. I believe Miss Violet Hope attended such an event shortly before her memory failed." "You believe she was a guest?" "No, I believe she was smuggled in." He paused before hailing a cab. "We are no longer simply investigating an assault, Watson. We are tracing the footsteps of a ghost, one whose reappearance threatens someone powerful enough to ensure she disappears again." "Where to now?" I asked. "Back to Baker Street," he said grimly. "We must examine that button more closely, and after that, Lady Weatherby must receive a visit from a violinist with a questionable invitation and a curiosity for unguarded secrets." I climbed into the cab, chilled more by his tone than the evening air. Already the case had acquired that dark shape I had come to know so well, a crime wrapped in privilege, with facts hidden beneath silks and shadows. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase, but I could not help but feel a mounting sense of unease. We had found the girl. Now we had to find the reason she was meant to vanish. The following morning, Holmes was already at his work table. By the time I descended to the sitting room, the scent of coffee mingling with tobacco and the faint, acrid tang of chemicals. The ivory button we had recovered from Violet's coat lay under the lens of his microscope beside a series of small smudges traced across notepaper. Holmes was humming, a sure sign that something in the case had begun to engage his deeper faculties. "Observe," he said, without looking up, gesturing for me to approach. "The surface of the button is delicately etched, machine-cut but not recent, mid-Victorian craftsmanship, ivory worn but not cracked, possibly from a child's garment, though oddly ornate. And here, note the groove along the back where a thread once passed. The thread was silk, expensive, black." I peered down. "Does it tell us who she is?" "No," Holmes said, "but it tells us who had access to her." He removed the slide and turned to the smudges on the paper. "As for the stain, rust, yes, but mingled with something else. I tested it before you came down. There are traces of animal glue and resin. These are used in the mounting of musical instruments, violins in particular." That gave me pause. She remembered a piano. Yes, but the detail is inconsistent. The smell of lavender and resin, the slowed music, it may have been distorted in her mind. Trauma often plays tricks, but what if the music she heard was not a piano but a quartet, or even a soloist rehearsing nearby? And what if the scent of lavender was not perfumed air but spilled oil? The setting she remembers is not a drawing room, it's a rehearsal hall. I considered this. And the masquerade? He rose. We must now entertain the possibility that our victim was not at a society function at all, but near one, perhaps concealed behind it. The Weatherby residence borders Calhoun Street, home to the Chamber Society's winter concert series. Lady Weatherby is a patron. Her masquerade was timed to coincide with a private rehearsal. He reached for his violin case and withdrew a folded invitation. This arrived last month, a favour from Lady Weatherby, to whom I once returned a lost diamond ring that had vanished into her third husband's boot. Holmes gave me a wry glance. She thinks me charming. I intend to use the illusion. I nodded. Shall I accompany you? Not this time, Watson. You are to visit the hospital, St. Thomas's. Speak with the nurse on duty last night. I want to know exactly what was recorded of Miss Hope, if anything. A woman fished from the Thames does not simply walk out without a trace. Someone must have seen her. And so we parted. It was near 2 o'clock when I returned to Baker Street, where Holmes awaited me with visible impatience, though he said nothing of it. I hung up my coat and gave my report. She arrived just past 1 in the morning, unconscious, soaked, bruised, no name, no possessions. The nurse on shift, Miss Gertrude Hales, tended her briefly before being called away. When she returned, Violet was gone. Did she walk out? No, that's the curious thing. The nurse said she wasn't strong enough to walk unaided, but no one saw her leave. There are only 2 exits, a main entrance and a service door for staff. The latter was found ajar that morning, though no one recalls opening it. Holmes considered this in silence. Then someone came for her, someone who knew she had survived. That confirms it. She was being watched. Her reappearance forced a hand. He stood and crossed to the window, drawing the curtains against the dusk. Watson, I found something myself, or rather, someone. He opened a drawer and produced a small envelope containing a photograph. It had the yellowed edges and uneven cropping of a private print. The image depicted a group of men and women, musicians by the looks of them, posed in formal dress before a chamber hall. At the centre stood a tall, angular man with a pointed beard and a slightly theatrical tilt of the head. "Who is he?" I asked. "Maestro Adrian Marceau, a violinist of some repute. He conducted several performances at the Calhoun Street Hall last month, and he's known for favouring unusual rehearsal hours, midnight performances, private, salons. I believe Miss Hope was in his proximity the night she vanished." "Was he at the masquerade?" "He was, and he left early." I confirmed this with the Weatherby footman. "But there's more." Holmes stepped across to the sideboard and took up the ivory button again. I showed this to Lady Weatherby under the pretence of admiring her embroidery. She claimed not to recognize it, but her expression shifted when she saw it, momentarily, a flicker of discomfort. She recovered quickly, but it was there. "You think she knows more than she said?" "I think she knows the girl, or once did, and more to the point, I think she is frightened." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it with a flick of the wrist and read in silence. "It's from Lestrade," he said at last. "A body has been found. Female, drowned, recovered just past Lambeth Pier. Identity uncertain, but the bruises, he says, match those of a Miss Hope." My breath caught. "Then she's—" "No," Holmes said firmly. "She is still here upstairs. This is not her, but someone wants us to believe it is." He tossed the telegram aside. "Come, Watson, someone has gone to the trouble of producing a second body. That is not merely concealment, that is orchestration." The implications settled heavily between us. Whoever was behind this had the reach to misdirect both the police and the public, and the desperation to risk such a bold deception. And now, it seemed, we were playing not just to uncover a crime, but to outpace its ongoing cover-up. Holmes turned, his face dark with thought. "We are no longer hunting a murderer alone," he said. "We are pursuing someone who stages murders as theatre, And in theatre, Watson, timing is everything. That evening found our sitting room dimly lit. The lamps turned low at Holmes's request, casting long shadows across the walls. Violet Hope sat near the fire, bundled in a shawl, her pale face turned toward the flames. Since her arrival, she had spoken little, answering questions with care, but volunteering nothing more than fragments. Still, there was a change in her now, a tension in her posture, as though a memory too long submerged had begun to stir. Holmes had taken up his bow and violin, drawing slow, deliberate notes from the strings, an elegy of uncertain tempo. He was watching her closely. "You remember this piece?" he asked quietly. She closed her eyes, her hands tightened around the shawl. "I think—" "Yes, not clearly, but it was playing." "Where?" "A staircase," she whispered. "I was halfway down. I saw masks, but not for dancing, not on everyone. Some were real, others only watched." Holmes ceased playing. He looked at me. "Do you hear her phrasing, Watson? Masks not for dancing. That is not the language of fantasy. It is trauma given shape. She saw deception."
Performance. Violet stirred. There was a corridor, blue wallpaper, velvet curtains, and a mirror, cracked at the corner. I was looking at myself in it. I think I had blood on my face. "Go on," Holmes urged gently. "I heard someone coming. I remember turning, then nothing. Just falling." Holmes leaned forward. "The mirror. You saw yourself, bloodied. Did you strike something?" "I don't know." "Could the blood have been yours?" She looked up, and for the first time her voice steadied. "No, it wasn't mine." Holmes stood abruptly. "We must go. Now. The girl is remembering not an attack, but a witness to one. She saw something, someone injured, perhaps worse. That's why she was silenced." I hesitated. "Go where?" "Calhoun Street. The Chamber Hall." I believe the event Violet wandered into, or was brought into, was not a masquerade at all, but a private affair, one whose secrecy required silence. Violet rose too. "I want to come." Holmes met her gaze, then nodded. "But you must remain unseen. We are not visiting as ourselves." Within the hour, we found ourselves near the quiet, stately street south of the river, where Calhoun Street sat tucked among stone facades and iron gates. Holmes had dressed simply but convincingly as a maintenance inspector, cap drawn low, with a coil of wire and a notebook tucked under one arm. I followed in a porter's coat. Violet, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, waited in the alley behind the building. The hall itself stood darkened, save for a single gaslight burning near the rear service entrance. Holmes approached it with practiced ease, produced a ring of keys, no doubt borrowed from some prior case, and opened the door. Inside, the scent of old varnish and polish lingered. Our footsteps echoed across the hardwood as we made our way to the lower level, where a series of rehearsal rooms branched off the corridor. "Blue wallpaper," Holmes murmured. "Velvet curtains. Let's see if memory matches stone." We found the room at the far end. The corridor's walls had indeed once been blue, now faded and peeling. And there, tucked behind a heavy drape, was the mirror Violet had described, its silvering tarnished, the corner cracked. Holmes examined the area with care. Beneath the mirror, a thin, discoloured patch marked the floorboards. He crouched and produced a small lens. "Watson, come see." I knelt beside him and looked. Embedded in the grain of the wood was a dark stain, dried long ago but unmistakable. "Blood," I said. "And not hers," Holmes replied. "She saw violence. This was the scene of a struggle, hidden since, but the attempt was imperfect. The floor was cleaned, yes, but the mirror left untouched. A careless oversight. And here," he gestured toward the baseboard. Faint scratching, as though something heavy had been dragged. A body, or a chest, perhaps a cello case, something large. enough to carry more than sound. I shivered. The hall, though empty, felt stifling. Holmes rose, brushing his coat. This was no accident, Watson. Miss Hope saw the aftermath of a crime. Someone discovered her and made certain she would forget. A faint sound reached us then. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. We extinguished our lantern and stepped into the shadows. A moment later, a tall figure in an overcoat entered the room, pausing just inside the door. Even in the dimness, I recognized the sharp silhouette, the swept-back hair, the proud gait. Adrien Marceau. He stood for a moment, staring at the mirror. Then he spoke, softly but aloud. She remembers. Holmes tensed beside me. Marceau turned his head slightly. I told you it was foolish, that no memory dies completely. She saw, and now he's dead for nothing. A second voice answered from outside. Female, smooth, clipped. She wasn't supposed to survive. Lady Weatherby. Holmes's hand touched my arm. His whisper was nearly inaudible. We go now. This is no longer a question of assault. It is murder and conspiracy. We crept away, back through the corridor, up the stairs, and into the night, where Violet waited, pale and anxious. Holmes gave her a reassuring nod. You were right, he said. Someone died that night, and you saw enough to make it dangerous. But who? She asked. Who was killed? We shall soon know, Holmes said. Now that we've confirmed the scene, we can match the bloodstain against the body Lestrade found. If they belong to the same victim, we have our connection. Violet looked away. What if I remember more? Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. Then you must tell us. Every detail. The truth, once it begins to return, tends to arrive in painful increments. But it is our greatest ally. As we walked swiftly through the fog, I glanced at Holmes. His face was unreadable, but his hands, normally so still, were flexing ever so slightly. He was close. I knew that look. The pieces were falling into place. And whoever had gone to such lengths to silence Violet Hope had just made their first irreversible mistake. We returned to Baker Street in near silence, each of us weighed down by the significance of what we had just overheard. Holmes was the first to speak once the door shut behind us. Watson, tomorrow you must go to the mortuary. Examine the unidentified woman Lestrade mentioned. Note every injury. Pay close attention to the hands, the skull, the fingernails. She is the ghost meant to replace Miss Hope. But if I'm right, she's also someone known, at least to those involved. Violet, seated again by the fire, clutched a teacup in both hands, though it had long since gone cold. Her eyes, which had earlier flickered with tentative memory, now stared into the flames with grim clarity. She wasn't a stranger to them, she said suddenly. The woman who died, I still don't remember her name, but she was wearing a red ribbon around her neck. I saw it in the mirror. She was lying on the floor behind me. Holmes's head turned sharply. A red ribbon? Violet nodded. Thin velvet. It looked tight, too tight. That's why I thought she was bleeding. Holmes stood and paced to the desk. That confirms it. The bloodstain in the rehearsal room wasn't an accident. It was murder, strangulation perhaps, or blunt trauma. And you were present immediately after the act. You were likely seen. Violet's voice dropped. They were arguing. Marceau and another man. Something about the ledger, that she wasn't supposed to have taken it. Holmes froze. A ledger? I think so. One of them said, she knew about the others. She wrote it down. Then the other told him to stop shouting. I ran. I must have... She paused, her breath quickening. I ran. I went down the stairs and out a back door, but someone followed me. I remember footsteps behind me. Then pain and cold. Holmes placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. That ledger is now the key. Not only does it identify the victim, but it contains the motive. Blackmail, perhaps. Or something worse. I leaned forward. Holmes, the woman in the morgue. Do you think she's the one with the ribbon? He turned to me. We must confirm it. If the ribbon is missing, or if marks around the neck are evident, then yes. The body was used as a substitute for Miss Hope, meant to close the affair neatly. It also tells us our murderer has already killed twice. Or more. I set my jaw. I'll be at the mortuary as soon as they open. Holmes nodded. And I must return to Lady Weatherby, not as a guest this time, as a threat. The next morning broke bleak and grey, the sort of morning that lends itself well to such grim errands as mine. The mortuary was cold, the walls tiled, and the floor silent, but for the occasional echo of footsteps. Lestrade met me there, his expression tight with suspicion. I heard Holmes thinks this woman is the real target now, he said as he drew back the shroud. She may be more than that, I replied. She may be the original victim of the crime that started all this. The woman before me was no more than 30. Her hair was dark, cropped short at the neck. There were bruises on her arms and discoloration around the throat, faint but unmistakable. Strangulation, I murmured. Lestrade grimaced. Water muddles that sometimes, but yes. She was choked before being dumped. I gently examined her hands. The nails were chipped, the tips torn, classic signs of a struggle. On her wrist, just beneath the bruising, was a faint imprint, a narrow indentation where something tight had been worn regularly. A ribbon, I whispered. Lestrade narrowed his eyes. You think it's the girl from the chamber hall? I do. And if we can identify her, we
can find the missing ledger. He scratched his chin. I'll put the word out. Quietly. I thanked him and returned at once to Baker Street, where Holmes was waiting, with an energy that suggested progress. Watson, he said, Lady Weatherby is not the cold socialite we imagined. She is frightened, but not of scandal, of exposure. She lied about not recognizing the button. In fact, she has garments in her home lined with the very same ivory fastenings. I spotted them in a sewing box in her private quarters. You went into her private quarters? She left me unattended with sherry, Holmes replied. What was I meant to do? I gave him a look, but said nothing. He continued. More importantly, I saw a portrait, one not hung in pride, but hidden. A girl, about 20, seated at a piano. She wore a red velvet ribbon and a pale green dress. Lady Weatherby referred to her once, I believe. Her niece, Annabeth Mercer. The name struck me. Mercer, that was the name on the old concert pamphlet you showed me. Annabeth was a violinist? A gifted one, Holmes replied. And a disappointment to the family, so I gather? Too curious, too free-thinking. She vanished 2 weeks ago. And no one reported her missing? She had done it before, or so they claimed. But this time, I think she stumbled into something. He handed me a letter, half-burned, retrieved from the grate at Weatherby's. It read, I have the names and the payments. If anything happens to me, the ledger goes to the press. I'm tired of protecting them. It was unsigned, but the initials AM were scrawled hastily in the corner. Violet, standing near the window, turned at the sound of the name. Annabeth, she whispered. Yes, that's her. She was the one lying behind me. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Then she tried to warn someone, and paid for it with her life. I looked from Violet to Holmes. And the ledger? It's hidden, but not far. Annabeth wasn't stupid. If she brought it to the chamber hall that night, she had somewhere in mind, a hiding place, and I suspect Miss Hope may know it, even if she doesn't realize yet. Violet frowned, closing her eyes. There was a piano stool. Heavy, too heavy. I remember pushing it. Holmes turned to me with a rare gleam of admiration. "Then, Watson, we are nearly there." That stool was not simply furniture, it was a vault, and it may hold the key to every blackmail payment, every name, and every crime this conspiracy has buried. He reached for his coat. "To the chamber hall. Tonight." The return to Calhoun Street came cloaked in the hush of a London night too quiet for comfort. Even the ever-present river wind had grown still, as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes and I moved quickly, Violet walking between us, her steps hesitant but determined. The gas lamps along the pavement sputtered weakly, shadows clinging to the buildings like forgotten debts. We did not enter through the front. Holmes, having studied the building's architecture earlier in the week, led us along a narrow side path to a small maintenance door half concealed by a broken trellis and an overgrown hedge. It opened with a soft creak beneath Holmes's hand. Inside, the familiar stillness of the chamber hall enveloped us, polished wood, echoing walls, and that scent of old music and velvet. Holmes moved swiftly through the corridors, passing rehearsal doors until he reached the very room Violet had described, the same blue-papered chamber with the cracked mirror and faded grandeur. He went straight to the piano stool. It was an old instrument, upright, its dark wood glossy even in the faint light. Holmes ran his fingers along the seat's edge, then crouched, inspecting the hinges beneath. "This is not original to the instrument," he murmured. "The stool was added later, perhaps by someone with reason to conceal something close at hand." Violet stood still, her breath shallow. "I remember pushing it. I thought I was trying to reach something under the keys. But maybe—" Holmes pressed on the right side of the seat with his fingertips, feeling for resistance. After a moment, there was a faint click, then the softest give of a hidden catch disengaging. The seat rose. Inside lay a shallow compartment, padded with green felt. And there, nestled within it, lay a leather-bound ledger, no larger than a prayer book, its corners frayed and the cover marked by ink stains. Holmes lifted it with reverence, as though retrieving an artifact from a tomb. He opened the cover, scanning the first few pages, his brow furrowed. "Names, dates, sums of money, cross-references. This is no idle blackmail. This is an accounting, carefully kept, with precision." He turned a page, then another. "My God," he muttered. "They paid for silence, for the disappearances of girls from the music academy, under the pretense of scholarships or placements abroad. They were being removed." "Removed?" I asked, incredulous. Holmes's voice was cold. "Eliminated, one by one, for knowing too much or saying too little." Violet sank into a chair, pale. Annabeth tried to stop it. She found out. She told me something was wrong. But I didn't understand until it was too late. Holmes snapped the book shut. "Now we understand, and now they will answer for it." But the moment fractured as the door creaked open behind us. We turned as one. Adrien Marceau stepped into the room, his expression as still as a mask, though the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed the strain behind it. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, gaze fixed on the ledger in Holmes's hand. "And you shouldn't have killed your student," Holmes replied calmly. Marceau stepped forward slowly. "You don't understand what this is." "I believe I understand quite enough," Holmes said. "You used the music academy to groom girls, not for artistry, but for exploitation. And when Annabeth discovered the truth, she tried to expose it." "She was reckless," Marceau said, almost softly. "She didn't see the consequences." "No," Holmes said. "She saw them all too clearly, which is why she wrote them down, and that is why you silenced her and tried to erase Violet as well." Violet rose, her voice shaking, but firm. "You pushed me. You followed me down the stairs. I remember now." Marceau's face twitched. "I didn't kill her. I found her, already dying. The others, they were ahead of me." "The others?" Holmes pressed. But Marceau said nothing more. Instead, his eyes darted toward the hallway, and I realized, too late, that he wasn't alone. Another figure stepped through the threshold behind him, Lady Weatherby. She held a small pistol in a gloved hand. Her eyes, steely and cold, did not waver from Holmes's face. "You're meddling with things far above your station, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned slowly, shielding Violet behind him. "I have rarely let class dictate the limits of justice." She raised the pistol a fraction. "Then you're about to learn the cost of that oversight." But even as she spoke, a shrill whistle split the air. Lestrade, punctual as ever, heavy boots pounded down the hallway. A moment later, 2 constables burst into the room, pistols drawn. Weatherby hesitated just a heartbeat too long. Then the weapon was wrenched from her hand by one officer, while the other seized Marceau. Holmes stepped forward, the ledger held aloft. "This," he said, handing it to Lestrade, "contains every name, every transaction, every missing girl." Lestrade opened it, scanning the pages, his mouth tightening. "My God, this'll take days to process." "Begin with the ones still breathing," Holmes said sharply. "Some of them may yet be found alive." Lestrade nodded grimly. "We'll take them both in." As the constables led the disgraced maestro and the furious dowager from the room, Violet slumped into the chair, her eyes wide but clear. Holmes knelt beside her. "You remembered just in time. You saved more than yourself." She looked at him. "What happens now?" Holmes gave a small, tired smile. "Now, Miss Hope, you begin again, with your own name, if you wish it." She hesitated. "It's Charlotte. Charlotte Violet Hope." "Violet was my middle name." He nodded. "Then Miss Charlotte Hope, I dare say you have lived up to your surname." She gave the smallest smile. And as we walked out into the fading night, the dawn just beginning to light the edge of the Thames, Holmes breathed deeply, his voice low. "There are cases, Watson, where logic solves the puzzle. But there are others, where truth survives only through memory. Tonight, we were fortunate that hers did." I said nothing. But as we turned down the path toward Baker Street, I couldn't help but feel that London, in its vast indifference, had almost swallowed another truth whole until Holmes reached down and pulled it free thread by thread. The following days were consumed by the slow, grinding machinery of justice. Lestrade, to his credit, moved swiftly once the contents of the ledger were confirmed. A series of quiet but decisive arrests rippled through certain corners of London society. Names that had once graced concert programs and charity invitations now whispered only in corridors of scandal and shame. The Chamber Society dissolved within the week, and Weatherby's name, once spoken with reverence in drawing-rooms and theatre lobbies, vanished into silence as her holdings were quietly seized and her associates scattered. At Baker Street, Holmes remained uncharacteristically subdued. The ledger still rested on our table for several days, its dark leather cover untouched, as though some unspoken weight remained in the room. He had taken only brief notes from it, satisfied to let Scotland Yard sort through the particulars. His interest, it seemed, had turned inward. "Charlotte's recollection," he said to me one morning as I set down his untouched breakfast, "was the only thing they could not erase. Not poison, not water, not fear. It endured, and all because her mind preserved one cracked mirror and the curve of a ribbon." "You're disturbed," I said gently. "More than usual." Holmes did not deny it. "This wasn't crime born of passion or desperation, Watson. It was curated like an art collection, groomed, catalogued, traded. a grotesque economy beneath the polish of the stage. "You're thinking of Annabeth," I said. He looked at me then, eyes keen. "She left us the trail and died for it. That ledger, thorough as it is, was never meant to be found. The names within, it's not only who they are, it's what they share. Ambition, power, and a willingness to obscure truth with performance." He stood, pacing to the window, his fingers steepled. "But one element still troubles me." I waited. "Marceau," he said at last. He spoke of arriving after the act, that he found Annabeth dying. I believed it a lie at the time, but now I am not so sure. He feared Lady Weatherby, that much was evident. She held the reins, but someone else tightened them. "You believe there is someone still at large?" "I believe there is one name missing from the ledger, and it may be the name Annabeth feared most." That very afternoon brought a visitor, unexpected, though not unwelcome. Charlotte entered with a letter clutched tightly in her hand. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with purpose. "I received this," she said, handing it to Holmes. He opened it, unfolding the fine cream paper with care. A single sentence was written in crisp, deliberate hand. "You may have survived, Miss Hope, but the music isn't over." Holmes read it twice before folding it neatly and slipping it into his desk. "It was hand-delivered," Charlotte added. "No address, no postmark." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "Then we must consider that someone watched her leave Baker Street," Holmes said. "Someone aware she had returned to herself and not yet ready to relinquish the control they once held." He turned to Charlotte. "Have you noticed anyone following you, a face seen more than once in different places?" She shook her head, but uncertainty flickered across her brow. "Perhaps outside the music hall this morning, a tall man, coat pulled high. I thought nothing of it." Holmes reached for his coat. "Then we must act preemptively." "What do you intend?" I asked. He turned, already fastening the buttons. "To go where all things end and begin in this case, Annabeth Mercer's old quarters at the Music Academy. The ledger was her record, but her journals, if they exist, may yet tell us what she feared in her final days." We moved quickly, Charlotte remaining with Mrs. Hudson under strict instructions not to answer any knock, nor admit anyone save us. The Royal Conservatory, located just off Russell Square, was half empty at that hour, the term break having sent most students home. With a few well-placed words and the authority of Holmes's reputation, we were granted access to the faculty wing and shown to the modest room Annabeth had once occupied. It was sparse, a single bed, a desk with neatly aligned quills and inkwells, a music stand in the corner. The window overlooked a courtyard grey with drizzle. Holmes scanned the room without speaking, then moved to the wardrobe. Inside hung only one garment, a green dress, identical to the one from the portrait in Weatherby's house. "She never took it," I said, quietly, even when she knew they were watching her. "Because it belonged to the girl she was before the truth," Holmes replied. "She meant to come back for it, I believe, and she never had the chance." He stepped to the desk and began opening drawers. The top one held loose pages of musical notations. The second held an envelope addressed to no one, but inside was a folded scrap of music, unfinished. On the back, in pencil, was a note. "If they take me, find the sonata in G. It holds everything." Holmes looked at me. "Do you see?" "I'm afraid not. The sonata is not just a piece, it's a code." He opened the music pages again, now scanning more intently. "Yes, here. Variations too strange to be random. She's left dates embedded in the composition. Ledger entries, perhaps. But what if they also correspond to meetings or locations?" There was a sound behind us. Holmes turned in an instant, stepping protectively between the desk and the door. It opened slowly. A tall man stepped inside, his features concealed beneath a dark scarf and hat. He did not speak. Holmes did. "You're late, Mr. Finch." The man froze. I stepped forward. "You know him?" "Weatherby's solicitor. He managed the trust that funded the Chamber Society. Quiet, bookish, just the sort who could balance corruption with civility." Finch removed his scarf. His expression was unrepentant. "She was going to destroy years of work," he said. "We built something enduring, something elegant. Do you know what these girls cost? How many benefactors they ruined?" Holmes's voice was like flint. "You turned art into a mechanism for trafficking, and when the truth emerged, you killed to preserve the illusion." Finch stepped forward. "And you think this is finished now because you found a diary and a broken girl?" "I think it's finished," Holmes said quietly, "because I left a note for Lestrade before I came. If we didn't return in an hour, he was to raid your home and your office." Finch paled. For a moment he looked as if he might lunge, but then his shoulders sank. Holmes gestured. "Now, Watson." I stepped forward and seized the man by the arm, snapping a pair of cuffs into place. He did not resist. As we escorted him from the room, Holmes looked back once, at the green dress hanging in the wardrobe, still and untouched. "I suspect," he said quietly, "that Charlotte will want it." Outside, the sky had cleared at last. Pale winter sun broke through, touching the stone buildings with a kind of reluctant grace. Holmes lit a cigarette as we walked. "There are crimes," he said, "which seek no profit, no pleasure, only control. And when that control is broken, when the truth stirs, they fall like glass." I said nothing, but I knew as we returned to Baker Street that this case, more than most, had cut beneath the surface, and the music Annabeth left behind would echo far longer than anyone expected. The following morning, Holmes sat unusually still in his armchair, not with his customary feline repose, but with the rigidity of thought in progress. His eyes were fixed not on a newspaper or manuscript, but on the fading embers of the fireplace. I recognized the mood. This was no mere moment of reflection. It was the quiet before a final conclusion, the moment when each thread of logic sought its rightful knot. Charlotte had left the previous evening, escorted home under Lestrade's protection. She had taken the green dress with her, holding it as one might a symbol of something once lost, but now reclaimed. Holmes had said little to her at parting, only a brief nod and the simple phrase, "You were the beginning, Miss Hope." She hadn't asked what he meant. I doubt she needed to. Now, as the fire gave its last flickers and the room held that odd hush between action and the memory of it, Holmes stirred. "There is one detail that still unsettles me," he said, without shifting his gaze. I looked up from my notes. "Only one?" He ignored the jest. "Annabeth, Mercer's ledger was damning, yes. Finch's confession was complete, but there remains the matter of her code, the sonata in G. You recall what she wrote. It holds everything." "I thought we'd found what it held," I said. "Names, accounts, meetings." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Too precise, too clean. The ledger was detailed, yes, but almost too well curated. The entries were chronological, orderly, even decorative. Do you not find that strange for a woman in hiding, writing under threat of death?" I frowned. "You think it was prepared to be found?" "No," he said softly. "I think it was prepared for someone else. Someone who never came." He stood, crossed to the sideboard, and withdrew the folded sonata pages from the desk where we'd secured them. He laid them out with great care and began to trace the notations with a finger. Charlotte mentioned something else. Music, slowed, twisted, as though distorted. Her mind connected that sound to fear, to the moment she saw Annabeth's body. But what if it wasn't simply a memory of sound? What if she was hearing something encoded? I stepped closer, trying to follow. "Holmes, you're not suggesting the music itself is a cipher." "Yes, I am." He turned toward the violin in the corner, took it gently into his hands and began to tune it. I watched, bewildered but intrigued, as he adjusted the strings not to standard pitch, but something flatter, more subdued. Annabeth knew her notes would be intercepted. The ledger may have been the surface. Names, yes, but selective ones, and beneath it, a second trail. One that leads to something or someone not listed. He began to play. The sonata's opening was gentle, haunting, a melancholy waltz in G minor that swelled and collapsed like the tide. But with each pass, Holmes played it slightly differently, shifting tones, elongating rests where there should have been none. It was not music as performance, it was music as message. I listened intently. There were odd pauses, too deliberate to be mistakes, and sharp, stabbing notes tucked between movements like coded interruptions. Holmes finished, bow, still poised in the air. 7 irregular rests, 5 sharp transitions, 1 motif repeated in inversion, mirrored. She wasn't just leaving behind a diary, Watson. She was pointing. To what? Holmes lowered the instrument. To someone who never made it into the ledger. He crossed the room and retrieved a small card from the table, a visitor's card that had arrived 2 days prior, bearing no name, only the crest of a private gentlemen's club known as the Minerva Society. They sent this after Finch's arrest. No note, no signature, but a quiet message. "We are still watching." He handed it to me. That emblem, harp and serpent, appears once more at the base of Annabeth's sonata, not part of the publisher's mark, deliberate. My stomach turned slightly. She was trying to expose someone within the Minerva Society? No, Holmes said grimly. She was trying to protect someone inside it, someone whose disappearance would explain the unfinished nature of her final warning. He turned back to the sonata, then tapped the signature. Annabeth was not working alone. The realization struck like a cold draft. There was another whistleblower. Holmes nodded. And they are still missing. The silence stretched as we both contemplated the implications. The ledger had helped unravel one network, but now Holmes had uncovered the hint of a deeper structure, one that hadn't yet been touched. "I must see Charlotte," Holmes said abruptly. We arrived at her lodging an hour later. Lestrade's men had rotated out that morning, but the housemaid recognized us and ushered us inside. Charlotte greeted us with faint surprise, the green dress folded beside her on the chaise. "I thought it might be over," she said. Holmes shook his head. "Not yet." "Do you know this crest?" He handed her the card. Her eyes went wide. "Yes, I saw it once. A letter Annabeth received. She burned it. Told me never to mention it. She said someone inside was trying to help her from within." Holmes's expression darkened. "Then she was trying to protect them, whoever it was. The names in her ledger, none include members of this society. It's a notable omission." Charlotte hesitated. "She mentioned a name once, not in full, just M. Said he helped her smuggle something out." "A copy of the ledger?" I asked. "Maybe, or something else." Holmes rose. "Thank you, I believe I know where to look." Back at Baker Street, Holmes plunged once more into the pages, this time searching not for names of guilt, but for names that should have appeared and did not. And there, at the margins of an entry dated 4 days before Annabeth's death, we found it, a symbol, faint, almost erased, the harp and serpent, no name, but a time, 1:15 Eastgate. Holmes stood still for a long moment, the meaning assembling like gears falling into place. "Watson, he said. "Prepare your coat. We are going to Eastgate Station, and I believe we are about to find the man, or his grave, who might have finished Annabeth's song." The cab to Eastgate Station rattled over uneven stones, its windows filmed with grime from the previous night's rain. Holmes was silent, his eyes narrowed, one gloved hand tapping the rhythm of Annabeth's sonata against his knee. The pace was quick, deliberate, 7 taps, then 5, then 1. I had no doubt he was mentally reviewing the cipher, reconstructing its hidden pattern, but I refrained from interrupting. His concentration had reached that dangerous altitude from which he often descended with revelation, or something more ominous. The station came into view, iron-clad, soot-darkened, and largely deserted at this hour, save for a few porters shifting crates and a solitary newsboy yelling out the Evening Standard's headlines. Holmes stepped out first, already moving. I followed him past the ticket counters and waiting benches, down a side corridor marked parcel and freight only. It reeked of engine oil and damp rope. No one stopped us. "This way," Holmes said, turning sharply. "The East Gate side platform, secondary track, less used. The time, 1:15, is not a train schedule. It's an appointment, a handoff." We reached a narrow gate flanked by rusting turnstiles. Beyond it, the siding curved into a blind arc where old carriages and crates sat forgotten under a canvas awning. Holmes paused. He crouched near the edge of the platform, fingers trailing lightly over the iron rail. Then he stood and pointed. "There, that crate." It was weathered oak, large enough to conceal a small piano or a man. A faded shipping label hung from a twine loop on the latch. Holmes tore it free and studied it. "Consigned to M. Warden, address left blank, contents marked educational materials." "Warden?" I murmured. "Is that the name?" Holmes shook his head. "No, a pseudonym. The name is the clue. Warden, a keeper, someone who held something dangerous, or someone himself imprisoned." He cracked open the latch with a thin tool and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a cloth bundle. Holmes unwrapped it with care, revealing not a weapon or ledger, but music, pages and pages of sheet music, tightly inked, the same hand as Annabeth's. But these were not compositions. The notes were too erratic. Bar lines were missing or misaligned. Between them were annotations in tiny script, names, dates, addresses, even diagrams. "A false score," Holmes whispered. "She created a second record, one hidden within musical composition, far more complete than the ledger. This is the true list." I peered closer. There are names here I've never seen, government names, theatres, academies. Watson, here, M. Warden is listed, cross-reference to an address in Southwark. Holmes scanned it quickly, then drew a sharp breath. She was meeting someone that night, a man who had once been part of the society but turned a whistleblower. And she was passing this to him, or retrieving it from him. Either way, he never made it out. He tucked the papers back into the bundle and resealed the crate. "We'll need to speak to the station master. I want records of who accessed this siding in the week before her death." We found the station master in a cramped, coal-dusted office, thumbing through freight invoices with a bored expression. Holmes presented his card. "Sherlock Holmes, I need to know if a crate was deposited here last week, about 5 feet long, consigned to M. Warden, marked educational." The man blinked, then slowly retrieved a leather ledger. He flipped pages. "Yes."
Logged 4 days ago, came from a private courier, no return address, no collection scheduled. Who brought it? The station master frowned. Didn't catch his name. Tall, heavy coat, gloves. Didn't speak much, left in a hurry. One of my lads said he looked like he'd been followed. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Then I was right. The handoff never occurred. Whoever was meant to meet Annabeth that night tried to hide the documents afterward. hoping someone might retrieve them. He turned back to the station master. "One more thing. Has anyone come asking about it?" "No," the man replied. "Why?" Holmes folded the claim slip into his coat. "Because they will. And when they do, I need you to send word to Baker Street." We left the station swiftly, but not before Holmes cast one last glance down the length of the siding, his gaze lingering on the rusting tracks as though calculating how close the past still pressed against the present. Back at Baker Street, dusk had crept into the corners of the parlour, and Charlotte was waiting by the hearth. She rose when we entered, eyes flitting from our expressions to the bundle now under Holmes's arm. "You found something," she said. "We found the real message," Holmes replied. "Everything Annabeth couldn't risk writing openly, she buried it in the music." He spread the pages across the table, and for the next hour we pored over the encoded ledger, piecing together the full scope of the conspiracy. It stretched further than we'd imagined: judges, publishers, schoolheads, even a sitting MP. All tied to the Chamber Society's network, all complicit in its rituals of grooming, blackmail, and silence. "Why did she keep this hidden?" Charlotte asked softly. Holmes didn't answer at once. When he did, his voice was low. "Because she knew the law couldn't protect her. She hoped someone would carry it forward, someone who could finish what she started." Charlotte's eyes met his. "You mean me?" Holmes inclined his head. "Will they come for me again?" she asked. "Not if we are swift," Holmes replied. "Lestrade has enough to open charges. The exposure of this score will force the others into the light, but it must be done publicly, loudly, before anyone can disappear." Charlotte nodded. "Then I'll do it. For her, and for the others who didn't survive." That night, as Holmes sat once more with the violin beneath his chin, he played the sonata in G from beginning to end, uninterrupted, and now fully understood. And as the final note faded into the hush, I realized it no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like justice. The following morning broke with a low fog settling over Baker Street, muffling the sound of the carts and carriages outside. I found Holmes already at the table, the morning paper discarded beside a pot of untouched tea. In front of him lay the coded sonata and the
contents of Annabeth's hidden archive, now meticulously ordered into a second, slimmer dossier. He looked up as I entered. "It's time." I poured myself a cup. "Time for what?" "For the truth to walk into daylight, Watson. We've reached the point where silence becomes complicity. The ledger, encoded as it was, is of no use to us if it remains in private hands. Charlotte has agreed to read a public statement. Lestrade will escort her to Scotland Yard at noon. And the press? Already informed. An anonymous tip to the Gazette and the Times will ensure a crowd is gathered. No court in England can suppress a scandal once it's on the front page." He stood, folding the dossier neatly and sliding it into a leather case. "We go as witnesses, not instigators, but we must be present. The moment is delicate. Powerful men are about to see the mask ripped away. Some will lash out." By the time we arrived at Scotland Yard, the front steps were already swarming. Reporters flanked the entrance, pressing close to anyone who looked remotely official. Cameras snapped. Policemen strained to hold the line. Among them, calm and firm, stood Charlotte Hope. She wore the green dress, no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a quiet declaration. Lestrade, flanking her left, offered Holmes a brief nod. "Right on time. We've kept the statement simple. No accusations by name, just the facts. Annabeth's disappearance, the false body, the coded ledger, the society's influence. The full list will follow in the formal report." Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the folded paper Holmes passed her. She glanced at him. "They'll try to discredit me." He met her eyes. Let them try, they'll be shouting against a crescendo. Then she stepped forward into the daylight. The statement was brief, 4 minutes, maybe 5. But each word struck like a hammer. She named the Chamber Society. She spoke of Annabeth Mercer's courage, she described the attempt on her own life, and at the end she lifted the folder and held it up. "This," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd, "is the score they never meant to hear." A murmur surged through the reporters. Lestrade stepped up beside her, announcing a full investigation and arrest warrants. It was done with the clean formality of law, but Holmes and I both knew the real work had already begun. There would be those who burned the evidence, fled the country, or hid behind layers of influence. But they had been named now. The truth had emerged. We made our way back to Baker Street that evening in silence. Holmes refused the cab, preferring to walk. The air was bitter, the fog thickening again, but he seemed almost invigorated. As we reached our door, he paused. "Do you hear that?" I stopped. Faintly, very faintly, on the breeze came the sound of a violin. Not from our flat. Somewhere farther off. High, tentative notes stumbling into a tune. Holmes smiled faintly. "One of the children from the conservatory, no doubt." The echo of a place no longer ruled by shadows. Back inside, he set the leather case on the table and poured himself a rare glass of brandy. "We did not bring her back," he said after a moment. "Annabeth. But we gave her voice one last stage." I sat across from him, staring into the quiet glow of the fire. "It's strange," I said. "The case began with a woman who couldn't remember who she was, and ended with her becoming the person Annabeth needed most." "She became a memory," Holmes said. "The most powerful role anyone can play." We sat for a while in the hush that follows a storm. Then Holmes rose, walked to the violin case, and drew out the instrument once more. He tuned the strings with deliberate slowness. "I believe I owe her a final performance," he said, "not as detective, as witness." He lifted the bow. This time he did not play the sonata in G. He played something older, more familiar, a simple lullaby, one I'd heard him hum absently in quiet moments, the sort a mother might play for a child or a sister for another, long after the lights had gone out. I sat back and closed my eyes, and in that music I heard no sorrow. Only a promise that no truth, once found, need ever be forgotten. The days that followed saw a transformation, not only in the headlines, which now bore words like conspiracy, exposure, and systemic rot, but in the atmosphere of London itself. The Chamber Society, once cloaked in prestige and patronage, was publicly dismantled. Arrests swept through a half-dozen boroughs, and the remaining members who had not fled abroad now stood trial. The name Annabeth Mercer, which had vanished from programs and polite conversation, was spoken once more, this time with reverence, not dismissal. Charlotte Hope, too, had changed. She no longer moved like a shadow of her former self, but walked with quiet resolve, her presence both gentle and unwavering. She visited us on a rainy Tuesday, the collar of her coat wet with mist, carrying a small parcel bound in brown paper and twine. "I wanted you to have this," she said, placing it on Holmes's desk. "It's a copy of the sonata, restored. A young composer from the conservatory helped me reconstruct the missing sections. We called it The Witness's Waltz. Holmes accepted it without flourish. It's a fitting title." She lingered a moment, then added, "And they found him." We both looked up. The man Annabeth was trying to protect, Emma Warden. His real name was Elijah Merton. He had been missing for over a month. They discovered his body in a warehouse near Southwark. Poisoned, quick and quiet. They made it look like he fled the country. Holmes's expression didn't change, but I saw his fingers curl slightly over the parcel. "She had so few left," Charlotte said softly, "and yet she trusted us." "She chose well," Holmes replied. After she left, the silence returned, as it always did after a storm. I stirred the fire and waited, but Holmes didn't speak. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the fog drift over the rooftops of Baker Street. At last, I asked, "Was it worth it, Holmes?" He turned to me slowly, that flicker of something, more than intellect, almost sorrow, passing through his eyes. "Justice is never neat, Watson. It's not a performance with a clear final note. It's more like a chord played into the dark, waiting for an echo. Sometimes it comes, sometimes it does not. But this time," Holmes picked up the restored sonata and tapped it lightly against his palm. "This time," he said, "we heard it." And with that, he returned to his chair, lit his pipe, and vanished into the smoke, not in retreat, but in reflection. So ends the case of the girl who wasn't meant to survive. A tale of silence, of music twisted into secrets, and of the kind of courage that blooms not in strength, but in remembering what others tried to erase. And though the names fade, and the dust of London swirls ever on, the melody remains, as it always must.